There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. Notice anything different? I'm debuting my new specs, my new spectacles, which I picked up just the other day, and quite an image change, don't you think? I put a photo up on Facebook immediately while I was still in the eyeglass shop, and I had two comments the same. One was from Alberta, an old childhood friend in Alberta, and the other one was, I think maybe Japan, that said aggressive. I would have never thought of that adjective, but I'm looking forward to hearing your adjectives as long as they're not horrific in the comments below. It was time for new glasses, updated prescription, and these are progressives. So I'm getting used to them, but I'm adapting to them quite well. I wore them till about 7 p.m. the first night, and then last night until maybe 10 p.m. or 10:30 p.m. So that's not ending up being much of a problem. I have one biblio adjacent adventure to tell you about. Last Sunday, Sharon Batalla came over to my mum's house, and I did too, and we had brunch, and then we watched the movie Small Things Like These from last year, based on Claire Keegan's novella of the same title, and it was great. I loved it. We all did. Sharon thought there was something different about the ending that I didn't remember. I thought it was exactly the same, except that they stepped a little farther into the house. But I'll have to reread that ending. I've read Small Things Like These twice, loved it both times, but I have trouble keeping the very specific details in mind. So that was lovely. That was the first time we'd ever done anything like that with Sharon Batalla, and we all enjoyed it very much. I have had an amazing reading week. I have lots to tell you. And I also have an absolutely amazing Mr. Guest, so let's go meet them first. And this week's Mr. Guest is Roland Allen, joining us from Brighton in the UK, the author of a buzzy work of nonfiction called The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper, which came out in 2022 in the UK and is now available in Canada as well. Roland, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Sean. It's a pleasure to be with you.
This is a really interesting topic, although I think you might have had to do a lot of selling to get it published. It's such an unusual topic now that it's come in print, everybody thinks, yeah, we should have had that book a long time ago, but did you have any trouble?
That's a really good question, actually. Yes, the short version is I did. It's very hard to get people interested in a book which is about more than one thing. People like books which tell one story, which have a very clear, identifiable through line, and all this is quite natural, and I do generally approve of it. I'm always myself very suspicious of books which are about more than one thing. But at pitch stage, at presentation stage, this book was very overexcited, and it had a lot of ideas in it and a lot of mathematics and art and literature and different time periods and settings. It was very hard to pull it all together into a coherent shape. My editors, in particular Mark Ellingham and Jonathan Buckley, did an amazing job helping me pull this thing into shape. There wasn't what you'd call a bidding war for it. Only one publisher was interested, but fortunately a really great publisher in the UK called Profile. And they then connected me to a fantastic Canadian indie publisher called Biblioasis. And fortunately, they were able to knock the book into much clearer shape. So now I can say it's about one thing. It's about notebooks and what notebooks can do for you and what they've done through history. And that's much clearer than where it started out.
I'm sure there's a whole bunch of things on the cutting room floor that might make some interesting books in the future. How on earth did you get into, how did this topic find you, or how did you find this topic?
The famous Hemingway quote, very slowly, but then very quickly. So for a long time, I kept a diary. I still keep a regular diary today. I work in the creative industries myself. I've worked for book publishers for many years, and therefore meet a lot of illustrators, a lot of designers, a lot of writers as well, but visual people in particular who use their notebooks and sketchbooks for all kinds of really interesting things. So for many years, I was just really interested by people's journals, diaries, sketchbooks, and creative notebooks. And then suddenly I just asked the question one day, where does it come from? When was the first? I thought that was quite an interesting but quite obvious question as well. I really didn't think it would be hard to answer. Very hard to answer, it took ages. Got there in the end, and the answer actually got there by following economic history. So it was the history of very early capitalism, which takes us back to the banking houses and merchants of Florence in about the year 1300. And when I was looking at that, then I realized, oh, there were these people doing this amazing things which they couldn't have done without notebooks. And then that was the big insight which set me going on the whole book. So there was this very long period of being interested in notebooks, but then the sudden question, where do they come from?
And what did people do before?
Good question. They didn't in many ways. We just weren't as sophisticated. Our lives weren't as sophisticated as they were once we had notebooks in our hand, because your paper notebook is actually a terrific tool, very versatile, very robust, very cheap. When you write in a paper notebook, it's permanent, which I think is really important. So what people did before that, most of the time in Europe, they used wax tablets. So you would have a little wooden frame which would open almost like a picture frame, and you would have a layer of wax on either side. You would write on the wax with a stylus, and it's very useful. It's very practical for taking lists. It's very practical for taking notes, writing things down on the fly in schools. But if you want to do anything permanent, it's really not practical at all. For doing anything like a contract, for the business record, which you don't want to be amended after the event because that's fraud, or for writing down anything particularly long, wax tablets aren't very useful. So there are various ways round it, but none of them are very practical. When the paper notebook came along, people suddenly had this way of doing things which they'd never been able to do before, to say nothing for sketchbooks. I don't think it's a coincidence that you get the first paper notebooks and then you get people in Florence who are really good at painting, much better at art than people had been before.
I believe Da Vinci made great use of notebooks.
And he wasn't, absolutely he was. Famously, they're the most wonderful notebooks, I think, probably to have ever existed. And he was quite open about it. He said this is a key part of his method, was always to have a notebook on his belt, always to be writing down his thoughts, his questions, always to be making sketches, always to be making lists. For him, it was absolutely the key part of his process.
I'm looking forward to reading your book, and the answer is probably there. But do we all owe this all to a bunch of nerdy capitalist accountants in Florence? Or did the notebook emerge spontaneously and around the same time in a bunch of different communities?
I love that question. In short, we do owe it to the nerdy capitalist accountants in Florence. But what you've got to remember, two things. Firstly, no one is just a nerdy capitalist accountant. People have many parts. The same people who were using their notebooks to do accountancy, bookkeeping, business in the daytime, in the evenings, who were at home, were using them to do other completely different things, which were much more fun. So, which went on to have a real influence on the way we react to literature or the way we write books. So, yeah, it was definitely those nerdy Florentines, but they were complicated people and they had wives and kids who used their sketchbooks and notebooks in different ways. It was a really local phenomenon. You've put your finger on something there. The Florentines definitely used notebooks much more than other people for about 100 years or so. So, for instance, you have notebooks in Florence for 100 years, and then Chaucer, about 100 years after they arrive, is writing about them in England for an English readership. He has to really explain what a notebook is. He has to say the pages are really bright and white, and you can do this with them, and you can do that with them. It's very clear that most people in England, unless they knew Italian merchants, wouldn't have seen a paper notebook. They just didn't know what they were like. Yeah, it was a very local thing for quite a long time.
That's just so interesting. Tell us about an early notebook that you either were able to look at physically or in some way study that would be illustrative of how this all got started.
I guess that one of my favorite ones, which there's no way I could have looked at it in person, is the Book of Michael of Rhodes. This is in private ownership. It's come up for sale a couple of times in the last 100 years, which is how we know about it. Fortunately, the last time it went through Sotheby's, a group of academics were able to grab it, photograph it, and work with the photos. So I've never touched it, but I've spoken to lots of people who have. The Book of Michael of Rhodes is this crazy book which was written by a Venetian sailor around the year 1430. So we're going back 600 years. And he started off maybe as a slave, maybe not as a slave, but certainly right at the bottom of the heap in Venetian society. He was pulling an oar on a Venetian ship as part of their merchant fleet. Over his career of about 30 years, he rose to be an admiral, one of the most respected commoners in the city, commanding ships, waging war on behalf of Venice. He had a fascinating life, and he left behind this notebook, which is this picture of what interested him. So it's full of mathematical problems, for instance. He loved maths, hundreds of pages of different maths problems, geometry, algebra, he was fascinated by in particular. And but there's astronomy as well. There's prayers and religious drawings which obsessed him. There's lots of ship diagrams, shipbuilding diagrams. There are these what you call portolans, which are like turn by turn instructions on how to sail all of the coastlines of Europe. He just clearly had a fascinating life, and buried right in the middle of it, there's his resume, his curriculum vitae. For 30 or so years, it details what ships he sailed on, who the captain was, what his job was, where he went, how long it took, things that happened to him. And this is our first professional resume in Europe. And clearly, he was using it at the end of each year to find his next gig, because everything was completely seasonal in Venice. You would have a job for a year and then it would end. So he managed to get his whole life down, all of his preoccupations in this book. And it's not a diary at all. There's actually very little emotion in it, but you read between the lines and know what interested him. It's fascinating, this story of a really humble guy who drove himself to the top, but also was intellectually fascinated by really complicated mathematical ideas, which didn't have any bearing on his life at all. It's a really inspiring document, and it's very telling. I spoke to several of the academics who researched it, a guy in Ottawa and a couple of American academics as well. Everyone who looked at this book fell in love with Michael, the sailor who had kept it. He was a really inspiring person, and it's miraculous that this book has survived 600 years. It's in a private collection now. They weren't allowed even to tell me who owns it, so I'll never see it. But it was such a pleasure to write about, and really falling in love with this guy just based on the photos of the notebook. That was a really inspiring story.
Wow. The more we're talking, the more I'm realizing how capacious this topic is. The notebook is the general category, and then we have things like accounting books and diaries and journals and artist sketchbooks, and then various lists and so on, and a polyglot type thing like you've just talked about. How did you manage that capaciousness in order to come up with a reasonably sized book?
Cutting it and cutting it right down. This was my editor's idea. He said, just tell stories. Pick a notebook, work out what its story is, tell that story, and then once you've got a lot of these stories, then you can construct the bigger narrative of how the notebook as a technology changed Europe and then changed the world. We'll grow out of it. In fact, the book, I think it has 30 chapters. The vast majority of them are biographical. Where I have someone's life or a moment in someone's life, I try and use that as the hook for the chapters. And the chapters, you can read them pretty much as short stories. I know a lot of people are reading it like this. And this is quite telling. For instance, at the end of 21 of the chapters, someone dies. That tells you that we're talking about people's lives. We're telling the story of their life viewed through the prism of their notebooks. If I start writing about you, your time's probably up. So that was how I did it. And then having all of these stories built a layer of the larger narrative. But yeah, it wasn't easy.
I can imagine. And you came to this, what you were following your nose as a diarist or journal keeper.
Yeah, I think it's a really good habit. It's one of the best things you can do. And one of the really nice parts of writing the book was getting to research the reasons why. Like a lot of people, I'd kept a diary when I started writing this book for about 14 or 15 years. So clearly, I thought it was a good thing to do. I'd put a lot of time into it. But if you'd asked me how or why, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. And now I can. Now there is so much psychological research about it. There is research on a philosophical level about it, which I think is really fascinating. and doctors use diary writing, nurses use diary writing in different ways. And this turned into a really interesting corner of the book. Towards the end of the book, I think people react very strongly to it when you're talking about the way in which writing a diary can improve your mental health, but it can also improve your creative life or your relationships or your place in the world, help you to understand the story that you tell about yourself. So I guess I knew that, but I didn't understand it when I started writing the book, and then and researching it and speaking to a lot of these people, speaking to the real experts about this was really eye-opening.
If you keep other kinds of notebooks other than a diary, what kind of other notebooks do you have?
A lot. Like one of the is quite interesting. When I started writing the notebook, I was enthusiastic about it, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And I learned so many ways to use notebooks in my writing. So when I was writing the notebook, I just filled notebooks with notes. They were a real mixture. So I'd be asking myself questions, putting in plans for chapters or plans for the book, taking down notes from books I was reading, the research I was doing, etc. And they were all jumbled up. Now I've learned, okay, I have one notebook which is just for nothing but plans and schemes and big picture ideas. And then for chapter one, I have the notebooks 1, 2, 3. And then for chapter two, I have the notebooks 1, 2, 3, etc. And then I've got other notebooks which are for nothing except preparation for things like this. Very often I'll make talking points, or certainly I used to. I'm a bit more practiced now. But if I've got a radio interview or something, I'll always make sure I've got my talking points written down in a notebook, or I'm doing a public appearance, another notebook. I totted them up, and I've got about 10 or 12 notebooks regularly on the go at the moment, all to do with either my personal life or what I'm writing or this book that I'm promoting or my day job.
And I'm imagining maybe 20, 30, 40 years down the road, so those notebooks that you have created during the creation of your book, The Notebook, will be in an archive somewhere, and some researcher is going to create their own notebook from your notebook about the notebook. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to destroy them. I'm really interested by this, particularly from the point of view of my diaries, because there's going to be a point. I think my children are going to find my diaries quite interesting in due course, and maybe if they have children, then they will get handed down a little way. But at some point, people are going to lose interest. I'm going to become an ancient relative who no one knew, no one cared about in 100 years' time. And I'm going to make sure that there are very clear instructions that at that point the diaries get deposited in an archive, that they get put somewhere where they will be open for people to look at, to research, because these diary archives exist now in a few countries. I don't know of one in Canada yet. That's not to say that there isn't one, but there's one in London, there's one in Paris, there's a great one in Italy, another one in Holland, just collecting normal people's diaries and notebooks. And these are amazing resources culturally and historically. I want to be part of that after I'm gone.
Absolutely. I guess we need to talk about the elephant in the room. We are meeting today, having this conversation because of the internet and computers. And that's throwing a kink in the works for the evolution of the notebook. Is the notebook becoming passe? I know not in your life personally, but wax philosophical. We find
Yes
ourselves.
and no. Yes and no. Someone said to me, and I was speaking to someone from a tech podcast, and he said to me, "We live in a digital age." I said, "No, you live in a notebook age." Capitalism ran on notebooks until after the war, didn't it? That's when you started to get IBM machines coming out. So that's a good 600-700 years of capitalism is notebooks. All of the authors which you read were educated using notebooks. All of the artists you look at, by and large, trained themselves using sketchbooks until very recently. Yeah, digital is everywhere. Yeah, we're entering into a digital age, but if I want to be contentious about it, I'll say that we're still in the notebook age. But in answer to your question, yes, clearly digital devices are everywhere. But what I think we're seeing is the pendulum swinging. When the iPad came in, everyone, it was like, oh, you can write on it, use it like a notebook, use it like a sketch pad, do all these incredible things. You absolutely can. Fact is that people mainly use it for watching TV. It's a consuming device. It's not actually as good a creative device. I don't know any writer who writes on an iPad. I know a lot of people who write on a computer, but I don't know anyone who actually uses an iPad to do serious writing. What I think we're seeing is this wave of enthusiasm, particularly in education, where people were very keen to get iPads, tablets, laptop computers into children's hands and get them into the classroom because they can organize the learning. Everything's really quick. You're clicking. The computer behind the scenes is adding up people's test scores for them, so the teacher doesn't have to do that anymore. Everything's multiple choice, so you can click. And I've seen this happen with my own kids. Now the schools are moving away from that. So my daughter, who's now 21, went through school doing a lot of work on the iPad like that. And I'm going to say for her, it didn't work at all. It wasn't a great educational experience. For the school, it might have worked at the time, but those same schools now are taking the iPads away. They're going back to the paper exercise books. And my son, who's 8 years younger, he doesn't use anything digital habitually, I will say. They all know how to do it, but they're much more studying their regular classes now. They're doing it in notebooks again. So the pendulum has swung back a bit. And I think that this is reflective of a wider trend. I think people definitely realize now the power of doing something with your hands and making something with your hands, which is just impossible to do when you're typing or writing on a screen.
As a transition into talking about Roland Allen the reader, I have a question about reading diaries or readers' notebooks. Do you have anything to say about that? Maybe personally or based on any of your research?
Quite a lot. I guess people do it in different ways. As a reader myself, when I'm researching, I try to write down notes in paper notebooks. Sometimes it's too slow, and I just make notes in the margins of the books I'm reading and go with that. There's a recreational reader. One thing I do, which I know a lot of people do, is keep a list of all the books I read in the back of my diary. So every year I probably read for fun 30 books, 40 books. And I've got a list now which is going back over 20 years of all the books I've read. So the Agatha Christie's and Dick Francis, and there's some proper junk in there as well as the really good stuff. But that's a really nice record to keep. All the books I've read over that period is quite a nice record to have. Then you have note taking for fun. When I was a teenager, I used to write down song lyrics in a notebook. I'd be listening to a lot of Bob Dylan and I'd write the lyrics down because it was the only way you could really focus on them and get your head around them, to have them written down on paper in front of you. And then you have the commonplace book, which for hundreds of years was serious educational tool in European schools. Very hard work to make a commonplace book, but it really pays off. And that's where you get people like Shakespeare, Milton, these sort of really big thinkers who are able to juxtapose really complicated ideas all the time. It's largely because they were trained in commonplace books, which were these sort of, you'd make a kind of encyclopedia of the humanities just for yourself out of quotations. Very well organized. And people did that for hundreds of years. Really hard work. No one does that these days. But
I do have one friend who is a voracious reader and she keeps a commonplace book. Shout out Lindy.
Shout out Lindy. She's doing
yes.
well. It is work.
What have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend, Roland?
I read a lot and I love reading. So I agonized for some time about what would be hip and cool and what would be interesting for your viewers, your listeners. And then I thought I couldn't make up my mind. So I just went with what I'm reading right now.
Absolutely.
Because they both happen to be really good books. Okay, so I'm reading Malice, Aforethought by Francis Iles. This is a nasty little thriller from the 1930s, probably 1931. And it's all about snobbery in a small English village. All of the characters so far have been absolutely ghastly. Not a single sympathetic one. I'm not giving anything away here. The protagonist is a doctor who kills his wife. I'm about two-thirds of the way through. It's absolutely gripping. I've got no idea what's going to happen next. Nasty little book from 1931. Really recommend it, particularly if you live in a small village and have to deal with all that crushing small town mentality, gossip, morality, all of that stuff.
How did that book come onto your radar? I've certainly never heard of the author.
It was because I listened to a podcast called She Done It. Are you aware of She Done It?
I've heard just the name.
A terrific, quite a long-running podcast from the UK. A woman called Caroline Crampton runs it, and it's all about the golden age of crime fiction, that 1920s, 30s, 40s Agatha Christie, Josephine Tey, authors like that. I suspect she gave the book probably a shout out on that. I do quite like to read those kind of older thrillers. I find modern thrillers quite annoying in a sense. I quite often try them and I can't get on with them if they're contemporary. I can read them if they're 90 years old. Don't ask me why. And maybe it's because I prefer the language or the element of traveling to a surprising setting in the 1930s. I don't know. But I really recommend that. Really thoroughly enjoying that. Professionally, I'm researching another book at the moment, which I can't tell you what it's about, but it's a very long running history. And it's about, again, a topic which is very big and needs to be broken down into small elements. As part of it, I'm reading this history of Antwerp, which is a city in Belgium. And it's called Antwerp, the Glory Years. And it's basically about Antwerp in the 16th century, or even just the middle of the 16th century. I had no idea. It was the most exciting place in the world. And it's just a fantastic popular history, which is a genre I love, which is the genre I write in, full of stories, full of amazing facts. It makes you look at the world in a slightly new way, even though it's all about Antwerp 500 years ago. And that's by Michael Pye, which is Pye, who has written a bunch of books. I think he's an American, but he's taken on this surprising subject and made it really sing. So hats off.
That's interesting, and I just had to Google the etymology of twerp to see if it might possibly be linked to Antwerp, and apparently not.
Those are the two books I'm reading at the moment.
Yeah, very good.
It's a representative sample, so a bit of
Absolutely.
crime and a bit of popular science, popular history.
Are you a fan of Dean Street Press? They republish a lot of murder mysteries from the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
I've not done a deep dive. I'm sure I'll have read the odd one. I can't tell you off the top of my head. The British Library, very busy in that area.
Absolutely. Simon
which
Thomas.
is a lot of fun.
One last question. Your bio on the back page here says that you enjoy stationery a little too much. Please expand on that. Or if you got some show and tell.
Yeah, sure. Hold on. This is my diary. Just started my new diary for the new year. There's the planner. I do my own planner in it. I write out all of the dates of the year, draw the lines with the ruler, etc. And there's the first day. Oh. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been using exclusively one particular kind of Japanese notebook. It's called the Stalogy. It's quite hard to get hold of, but I'm very fussy about it. I love the binding, the paper, the material that the cover's made of, and the fact that it's flexy and nice, and yet it still has a page for every day of the year, 368 pages. I'm very nerdy about that notebook.
Awesome.
And a lot of people are quite particular about their pens, I find. A lot of people have a favorite pen. I'm nerdy to the point that I can tell you that this is a Uniball I Micro UB150 in black. So that's the UB150B.
And we share that
UB150R in red. I'm geeky about that stuff. And I only use these pens. I'm fussy about things like that.
When I kept a journal on paper, and I have to admit it's been many years since I've done so, I would have, I think, almost that exact same Uniball, but in varied colors, and I wouldn't use the same color twice. Like one day to the next, I'd change colors so that I could easily see one. I'm going to start nerding out here. The subject. This is fantastic. Roland, this has been an absolutely stimulating conversation. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And I hope you'll come back.
Real pleasure, Sean. I hope you enjoyed the book.
Thank you very much. So this is the UK edition of the Notebook by Roland Allen that I got from Blackwell. He was surprised that I didn't have the Canadian edition, which is what the cover gif I put up. And I didn't really realize that it had been published in Canada as well. Anyway, what a fascinating guest. Oh, and it's kind of editing, Sean, but it's so easy to do with this new program. I forgot to mention that while I was editing the Mystery Guest Chat, and heard Roland rave about these Japanese notebooks, Stalogy. I looked them up, and there is a distributor in Canada, so I promptly ordered one for myself. Let's see how having a fabulous Japanese notebook is going to change my life. I'll show it to you when it gets here, and I'll put a link to that distributor in Canada, and you'll have to search for if Stalogy sells notebooks in your country. I made a library book vlog last fall, I think in October, and it has taken me until this week for it to come to the top of the pile in terms of editing it and posting it. So it went up a couple days ago, and I'm surprised. I never thought that my library book vlogs were all that popular, and I still don't think they necessarily are. But the people that love them really love them, so it had some lovely comments. A library book vlog, first of all, if you're new to my channel, you're wondering, what the hell is a vlog? When I first came to BookTube 100 years ago, I called it a vlog because I was so stupid. Somebody said, no, it's actually vlog, pronounced vlog, and I thought, okay, I'm going to keep that as my trademark, and so I have ever since. I'm so cool that way. Yeah, no, there hasn't had that many hits, but I've had almost as many enthusiastic comments on it as I have hits. What I do is I just go to either the university library or the public library or both and pick out about 6 books, read the first chapter, read the first 10 pages, read the first short story, and then check in on what I think about it and which one I think I'd be most likely to try in the future. I love doing that. Anything that lets me play with books is a good use of my time, I think. Oh, I didn't say that in addition to, and I'm not going to say much about it for about a month, but I'm trying out a new piece of software that automates a lot of the tedious aspects of video editing. If it works, I'm going to get a year's subscription. I got another incredibly generous donation. Kathleen from New Mexico sent me another very generous donation. If I like my 1-month trial of this software, I'm going to purchase a yearly subscription. God, I'm old enough to remember when you could just buy software. You didn't have to freaking subscribe to it or rent it. I hate that so much, but everybody's moved in that direction. So it's very pricey, and if it does what it promises to do, I'll tell you the name of it. It's Descript, like description without the I-O-N, Descript. And I've been playing around with it this week, and so far, so good. This will be my first Friday reads that I'm doing exclusively on it, including recording this video directly to that software. So we'll see how it goes. If you want more information on it, you can Google it yourself. I'll give a fuller review at the end of February. I have finished 1 book, and I have started 2 that I'm going to tell you about. I'm not starting any this week, so that's what's left for me to... If you hear that squeaking, I'm babysitting my mom's dog. So he's playing with a squeaky toy at the moment. Well, I actually just remembered there's 1 more I will be starting, but I have temporarily misplaced it, so I'll have to make a note to remember when I get to that part of this broadcast. The book that I finished, I have loved from chapter 1 right through to the end. Another 5-star read, this Canadian novel, This Bright Dust, by Nina Berkhout. Published last year by Goose Lane. I was provided a review copy from the publisher for an honest opinion, and here is my honest opinion. I will also be doing a full chat with Nina about the novel next week. As I've said before, it's set in 1939 in Alberta, and at this part of Alberta, the Dirty 30s was still really active. Like, they were still in a farming community, like a hamlet that has been so deserted that the elevators are tipping over and there's nobody living in the tiny hamlet at all, and these are 2 farms adjacent nearby. Our protagonist is a 27-year-old farmer, a poetic soul and an old soul, so he seems much older than that, Abel. He lives across the way from the Wisharts. He has been in love with his former classmate, Una, the granddaughter there, who's has a son born out of wedlock who's about 7 or 8. I love this novel so much. It was so atmospheric. The description of the farming, the dust storms, and when rain finally came, and there's a hailstorm, unfortunately, and all this and that. The nature writing in here was just sumptuous. And the character work was also divine. Abel was a likable character who had trouble letting anybody get close to him, and that actually worked, I think, in the narrative. You, the reader, get to know him, but you also feel the remoteness, and that there's more layers to him than are revealed to you, the reader, even. And he is one of those, in terms of his love life, he just needs to, I'm not going to say that my mom said this, but I learned this really sophisticated idiom as a kid. Shit or get off the pot. And Abel struggles with that. I should say the other important part of the story is that the the royal tour, the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Canada, King George VI and his consort, Queen Elizabeth, who later was the Queen Mum, did a 8-month tour of Canada. It was a very famous event, and there are a bunch of different political opinions about that impending visit, threaded through the character work and threaded through the story really beautifully. So if you're opposed to the monarchy, there'd be stuff in here that would challenge you and that you would agree with, and vice versa. This was a challenging read for me because the anti-monarchical sentiment was well expressed, and I just thought to balance that so beautifully and to make it work in a story about a young man and a young woman, but two neighboring farm families, was stupendous achievement, I have to say. I loved it. I read this to Mary Jean. She loved it. If I had a criticism, it would be that there was some very minor potted stories. There was a story about his father's old war friend that I thought was over sentimental and didn't need to be so sentimental. This was, like, we're talking, the anecdote itself took up about a page and a half, and it did resurface throughout the novel, and every time it did, I thought, that was just a little too much for me. There is one incident that occurs when Abel goes to the nearby city, which is a fictional city called Sterling, where he encounters a rough guy, and there's a conversion that happens. I'm not going to give anything away, but the guy is aggressive, and then through the strength of Abel's character, he changes this guy's life, and I thought that was a little bit much, too. Those two very small quibbles aside, I recommend this with all my heart. I loved it so much. You must read it. I am now a ways into Elizabeth Jane Howard novel called Odd Girl Out from 1972. As longtime Friday Reads viewers will know, I've been buddy reading the Elizabeth Jane Howard oeuvre in publication order with my friend Leah in Calgary for years now, and this is the latest one. As usual, this is going to be a banger. For some reason, that word, it's British slang, isn't it? Is it already out of date? It's just finally showed up in my vocabulary. I sent Joe, my dear friend Joe, perpetual buddy reader and booktube consumer, a message today to say that I had taped the next three, including today's, the next three mystery guest chats, and they were all bangers. I've never used that word before. I hope I'm using it right. Anyhow, to get back to Odd Girl Out. Her later novels have a lot more humor and a lot more darkness. No, that's not true. I think her novels always had darkness, but there wasn't a whole lot of humor until maybe the last couple, and this one also. So this is a convoluted family. The scene opens with a young married man, and he loves his wife in such a patriarchal way that he won't let her get up out of bed or obviously get dressed until he leaves for work. He wants to see her in bed in her nightie and just talk to her, and doesn't want her to get up and do anything. And she does kind of want to get up and get her started with her day, but no, she's got to stay in bed. And that just creates an image of a marriage that's so revealing. And he has a stepmother who has long been divorced from his dad. I think his dad is dead. And she's been married 7 or 8 times. She's now married to some European prince. And she is having trouble, this stepmother, with one of her daughters who's in her 20s, Arabella. And so she asks if Arabella can come and stay with Edmund. Now, Anne, I think she's met the stepmom once or twice, never met Arabella. I don't think Edmund had met Arabella before. This stepmother just kept getting married and moving farther away. Arabella comes to their house outside London. She has an abortion, and then she goes directly to this town, and she's just a hot mess. Not because she's had an abortion. Well, it's a very emotionally upsetting to have an abortion. It's described in vivid detail here. She hasn't really got it together on any level. The young married couple aren't really sure what to do with her, and that's as far as I've got. But it is, as usual, intricately plotted. Character work is fascinating, and it is really quite funny in places. So this is starting out great. I'm about 60 pages into this Chinese novel in translation, a buddy read with Joe Smith, called Graft by Li Peifu, if I'm pronouncing that right, translated from the Chinese by James Trapp. And we are both loving this. It is set in the 1980s on the central plains of China. The father, I'm not going to give any names because it's too hard to follow a review or a commentary on a book that you haven't read and try to keep track of characters' names. I've learned that from years of doing bite-sized book chats. The dad is a gardener. Not world-renowned, but he's really famous throughout that whole region of China. He does bonsai and grows flowers, and that's where part of the title in part is because of that. And there's a vivid description of him. I don't even know what the word is, transplanting, but basically grafting an old root to make another plum tree grow. I can't talk about it because I'm so obtuse about it, but it was beautifully described. I loved that. And he has an adult son who we find out in the first few pages rises to national promise as a mayor and then as a governor of a Chinese state and so on. And we follow that son through high school up to, well, where I'm at now. He keeps getting promoted because, well, it's kind of a mystery and part of the charm of the story why he keeps getting promoted. And by this stage, and he's only about 28, I think he's the deputy mayor of a city. That's basically the story, but I'm not doing it justice because it's really richly told and easy to understand. There are Chinese characters in here where they're explained in context, and we're given there's one, like, talking about why that character, what it means, and how it affects this unfolding story. This is published by Sinowest Books in London, which exclusively publishes Chinese literature in translation. This novel and this press were passionately recommended to me by Roland Allen. So, the book I can't find, and I'm going to blame it on the maid. Mom and I share a house cleaner. She's never done this before, but she actually moved books in my living room, and she kind of consolidated them into several short piles on the coffee table so I could see over them. She moved them from this end table and off from the floor. So I can't find the book that I'm going to read to Mary Jean next, but let me tell you about it. It's by David Carpenter, and it's a mystery. It's a novella. And if you're new here, David Carpenter is a local writer, and I've been doing a series of interviews with him for the last year or so. I will interview him about this mystery when I'm done. And you know that I'm not a big fan of mysteries, so I think that's why Mary Jean said, let's do that one next. It's called Luck. The story is in 2003. Two wealthy old friends are murdered on the same day and plot ensues. The detective is Bill Schmata, which sounds Japanese, but it's not Shimata. It's Schmata. So we'll see what that's all about, if I can find the book. But I should have mentioned before, reading This Bright Dust with the royal family, basically being kind of characters in the story, I mentioned to Mary Jean that I had a book with a hilarious essay about Queen Mary, Osbert Sitwell's essay collection, Queen Mary and Others. I read that 40-page essay to my friend Leah a couple years ago, and I almost peed my pants reading it to her. Mary Jean said, let me hear that as a palate cleanser. I'm 2/3 of the way through reading it, and I think you can find this online on archive.org. I haven't read any of the other essays, but the title essay is to die for. It's so funny. All right, that's my Friday reads. Thank you so much for watching.